Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We have people listening to us at the excuse me, the allergies. West Coast, it's midday. It's mid-afternoon on the East Coast, evening over in Europe, and very, very, very early over in Asia, including Australia, where our main man, Carl Palachuk, is putting on a series of workshops. Be sure to look that up. If I think today, which is tomorrow, is Melbourne, Australia. So a little bit of housekeeping. Again, Harry Brailsford, SMB Nation. I am coming to you live from Austin, Texas this week. Last week was Las Vegas at the Continuum Conference. This week I'm coming to you live from SpiceWorks conference called Spice World. And a little feedback for you. First of all, Austin holds its own. It's a lot like Portland, Oregon, a little bit smaller than Seattle, certainly a tech hub. And then with the SpiceWorks audience, I've heard it called Comic Con for IT. So you have people in costumes, and it's a 2,000-person show. It's a handsome conference, probably about 30, 40 vendors out on the floor, including some names we know in the industry that I was surprised to see from the MSP community. But with that all said, be sure to use the question feature to ask your questions. Next week, we're back for the next installment of fall semester with MSP Tech Talks, so same bat time on Wednesday at noon Pacific. And of course, as always, think of us like public radio or public TV. And by that, I mean we're here because of your support, and equally important, the support of our generous underwriters. And this is being underwritten by Fortinet today. We're going to have another conversation with Fortinet as we do every week at midpoint, roughly about 12:30ish, somewhere in there. We'll have a moment with them, and we appreciate you paying attention to that. It's what makes this series possible. So with that said, we got a pretty busy day. This is a fun one. We have Mark Scott, and Mark, I'll bring you in just a second, but Mark goes back probably further than myself in the Seattle area, and he has been a major player for all that time in a slightly different realm. So this is over in the training realm. I'll let you, he'll properly introduce himself, but we have crossed paths over the years and come full circle, and here we are again today, and he's the man behind SQLsoft 3. So people in the Pacific Northwest may remember SQLsoft, and that's now reincarnated as SQLsoft 3. So Mark, good afternoon, sir. Thanks for joining us. Your lectures are always academic, and we appreciate that. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Harry. Thanks for the introduction.
Well, let's, sir, you have the talking stick and the wand. Let's jump right into it. These people love content.
Oh, good. Well, there's a lot of it today, so we'll try and click through it, and so it's at a pretty high level. But real quickly, Harry gave you a little bit of background. Today, we're going to talk about kind of people's cloud journey from a security standpoint. It's not about getting to the cloud, but getting there safely. So with that, I'm going to do a quick introduction about SQLsoft. So SQLsoft 3, third iteration, we're a Microsoft Silver partner. We offer training, consulting, and mentoring services around Azure, Office 365, security, BI, big data, on-prem servers. I'm the CEO of SQLsoft 3. I'm a certified cloud security professional, EU General Data Protection qualified, and I've been a private business owner for 20 plus years. So before we get started, let's go ahead and lay a little groundwork here before we get into the content. And this is going to break up about the first half hour is going to be kind of level setting, just kind of getting everybody familiar with the foundational concepts. And then we're going to go ahead and have our break with Fortinet, and then we'll go on the back end of the kind of the meat of the presentation after the break. So with that said, let's start with everybody that should be at the table and kind of understand their roles. And as Harry alluded to, I've been at this a while. I've been at this long enough to have gone through the kind of the explosion of the internet back in the late 90s. And there's a lot of similarities that I see in terms of kind of where we are in the market space between kind of cloud computing and where we were with with the introduction of the World Wide Web in the 90s. But what's interesting is that I think that it took a while for, you know, technology was kind of, was this big driver here in the internet in terms of allowing people to do really cool things with websites, and it just really opened up a new way for people to do business. And, you know, more and more, you know, people were putting in ERP systems, and there was, you know, all this process automation, and we created a bunch of operational frameworks and so forth. And there was a maturing process, and it took a while for the business objectives and the IT guys to kind of come to the table and kind of get in sync in terms of what were the objectives of the business and how was technology going to map into that. Because technology just became increasingly wrapped around the business objectives and the processes. And I think we're kind of in a similar spot now with security. And I think that it's important because I think we have this opportunity to kind of not repeat history. And that took us a while to kind of get IT, I think, you know, to the big person's table and be talking about these business decisions. And I think if we can get security there earlier than we did with IT, then I think that's going to serve us well. And there's a lot of reasons where we're going to go through the back end of the presentation here as to why that's important, because just as the commercialization of the internet was you know, a big deal, the cloud computing is equally as big. You know, I guess I can recycle the term. You know, we really are in a paradigm shift in terms of the way that businesses are operating and utilizing their digital assets and so forth. So ultimately, you know, we want to have the business stakeholders there. We want to identify their strategy. You know, they're going to define the risk appetite of the organization, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. You've got IT, that they understand the business needs, and they're designing and implementing systems to support those needs. You know, and they're always there trying to improve business efficiencies and utilize technologies to further the business goals. And then you've got, you know, business and information security. They need to understand the operations of the business. They're responsible for designing and implementing and putting in place security controls that support the needs of the business and are consistent with the risk appetite of the business. And they also want to minimize the impact of security on business efficiencies. So, you know, there's a natural tension there. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with IT. Sometimes it's not always the most secure thing. There are things that we have to put in place that sometimes are kind of hinder or slow down progress. But I think that in the overall picture, I think it's the prudent way to move forward. And I think the sooner we get the security people to the big table and having these conversations, I think the better off we'll be. So as we move forward through the presentation, I want you to keep in mind the security triad, and maybe some of you have seen this before, but just again, we're just kind of level setting here. But what is a security triad? Well, it's all about, often referred to as CIA, but it's all about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information to the organization. And it's not just, this applies not only to you know, electronic data, but just overall, just from a security posture. So the first one is confidentiality. We want to protect information from unauthorized access or dissemination, right? There's certain things you want to keep private, business, trade secrets, personal information, those types of things. So that's one part of the triad here. The other is integrity. So make sure that information is not subject to unauthorized modification. In other words, people aren't messing with your financials. They're not adding a zero to an order. They're not changing information. That you want to maintain the integrity of the data. And the last bit is availability. In other words, let's make sure that people can get to the information they need when they need to and what they're permitted to do so. So this kind of rounds out the triad. And if you think about the CIA triad through our whole discussion of security here, you know, that's really where it all, you know, everything will map back to making sure that this information is confidential. And, you know, it can be trusted. It has integrity, and it's available. So the Cloud Security Alliance is a group that puts out about every 3 years, they put out kind of the threats about surrounding cloud computing. They put one out in 2016. These are the top 12, the treacherous 12 as they're referred to, that people need to be aware of with cloud computing. So the top of it is data breaches. Obviously, we see that in the news fairly regularly. weak identity, credential, and access management, insecure APIs. I can go down through the list. You can look through this. But it is important that we're aware of these threats and that they're addressed whenever you're moving things maybe from an on-premise environment and moving it into a cloud environment. So, and why this is important, I was at the Cloud Security Conference here about 2 weeks ago, and there was a major player in the Microsoft security space there. He gave his keynote, and this is going to go to why you want to keep this in mind. Well, 95% of security issues and failures of cloud services will be the fault of the customer rather than the security provider in 2020. So what is it? That's 3 years out. Clearly, there's a problem. There's a challenge here, right? I mean, a lot of things are happening to make computing safer, better, faster. Machine learning is coming into play. All these types of things, and a lot of it is always, boils down to the weakest link, which unfortunately tends to be humans. But anyway, keep that in mind as we move forward, because we will be discussing what some of the vendors have done to address and to try and minimize the security issues at hand. But that just, again, that's just kind of a striking, that was a striking thing from the keynote that I attended a couple weeks ago. So let's quickly go through architectural concepts. What is cloud computing? You've probably seen this before. The NIST defines it having these characteristics: on-demand, self-service, broad network access, resource pooling, rapid elasticity. Most important for the cloud providers, measured service, which means they can bill you. The on-demand, right? You should be able to get at it without any intervention from a vendor or anything. You can just, hey, I need to deploy some disk resources. Great, I can do that. It's available on the internet. Resource pooling, that's where some of these efficiencies come from the ability to share compute and storage capabilities. And then rapid elasticity, obviously the ability to kind of spin up and spin down as needed. So the advantages have been, we talked about that briefly here, the managed data center, lowering operational costs, server consolidation. It's all about, it started out really being about the efficient use of the hardware and the computer and the disk that you had in the cloud, where oftentimes they're sitting in your own data center and they're idle during the evening, depending on the size of your business. If you're a global business, they might be on all the time, but the loads are very sporadic, and oftentimes you ended up buying more computing power than you needed. So cloud computing has helped with that. Provides better flexibility and speed. We've got all kinds of services coming online available on the cloud. A pay-as-you-go model, and a lot of people shifting from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. You've probably seen these on other presentations, but the idea that you don't have to guess what your hardware and software requirements are going to be at the beginning of the budget year. You kind of you understand what your burn rate is, and you've got some flexibility there in terms of how you utilize and expense that from a financial standpoint. And sometimes cloud computing will provide some better security than you might have today. So quickly, we'll move on to the service models. So, right, we started off, in the on-prem world with physical standalone servers. Fairly quickly, VM, Hyper-V in the Microsoft environment came on, and we were able to virtualize these servers, which provided, some additional speed at which we could deploy servers and flexibility, and it helped us with backups, a lot of things. And then we moved into the cloud, and we started off with the infrastructure as a service model, where a lot of people took advantage of this early on, which was simply referred to as lift and shift, or moving their data operations into the cloud in the traditional server model, where you had you just virtualize the server, put them in the cloud, you have virtual firewalls and all these types of things. So it's really just moving your own environment into the cloud. Then we've got platform as a service, which are these services that just continue to be pouring out from Azure and AWS, which are very specific functions that you can take advantage of through APIs. And the last bit is the software as a service model, which is really what Office 365, Dynamics, and the Microsoft world provide for us. And it's interesting sometimes to think about the line between the platform as a service and software as a service, right? Because when Microsoft's putting out Office 365, they're actually consuming platform as a service services to provide that software as a service. So Depends on whether you're actually providing software as a service or maybe consuming platform as a service to create software as a service. So those are our three main service models. And then we move to the cloud deployment model. Oops, sorry. Which you may have seen this private cloud, community cloud, hybrid cloud, and public cloud, which is really what we're talking about today, which are owned by a Microsoft or a Amazon or a Google, selling services to the general public or a large industry group. I think it's important here to point out, I think a lot of people, typically a hybrid cloud by definition is you're actually moving information between clouds. But I think today when people talk about hybrid cloud, a lot of the times what they're talking about actually is the mixture of the IT or the on-prem infrastructure and the cloud infrastructure. So along with these service models come the customer and provider responsibility, and we have a matrix here where we talk about the various security components on the left side here, security and governance, data security, application security, platform infrastructure, and physical security. And then we move across and we've got what our typical on-prem, what we had to deal with in an on-premise environment, and then what we're responsible for as we move across from the infrastructure, platform, and software as a service models. And it's important to point out that there are really clear distinctions in terms of what you, the customer, in green are responsible for, what the cloud provider is responsible for there in the purple blocks, and then you've got some areas there where you've got some shared responsibility, which are represented by the blue blocks. And that's important. We'll talk about that, the importance of that a little bit later on. But it is important that we understand that it is a shared model and that you're not just going to adopt the cloud and your security responsibilities go away. Depending on the model, you may have just about the same or very similar responsibility. So then let's move on to the foundational cloud concepts, right? I think the idea here anymore is that in the on-prem world, you had you kind of stake out a fence around your IT, and you had a very strong perimeter. You protected things in a firewall, and now the perimeter has actually moved to these APIs. And so the idea of having a perimeter will, I think, over time fade as all of these cloud services are available via APIs, and those APIs need to be secured. Some other things to think about are cloud service provider contracts, defining the terms of service, responsibility, billing, costs, all those types of things, and service level agreements. It's important to think about those two things because, again, this is going to be kind of out of sight. It shouldn't be out of mind. You need to be paying attention to what those terms of services are, what they do and don't do. The cloud providers have done an excellent job of writing those terms up to push as much of the risk off to you, the consumer, in most cases. So there are some areas where you may have some room to negotiate depending on the size of the business you are. Auditing and compliance, a lot of businesses are subject to compliance regulations and go through audits and so forth, so that's something to consider. It's more difficult in the cloud, but it is a driver and something you need to be considering as you move operations into the cloud. The other thing to being aware of, sensitive data, personal information, the corporate crown jewels. Again, this is an important concept because you're moving this out of an area where you actually have physical control over these assets to now virtualized. A lot of these can be sitting on virtualized hardware in the cloud. And then leads us to our next point, virtualization, the idea of abstracting the actual hardware so that you're dealing in a virtualized environment. That happens from a server standpoint. That happens with these containerization and these types of things from a development standpoint. Multi-tenancy, the idea that you are renting basically an apartment and all that goes with that. You don't know who your tenants are. That can be a concern or something, a concept to be aware of as you're going through and evaluating what and how you're moving into the cloud. And the last bit is encryption. Again, because your assets are not protected around you or are not within your direct purview. One of those strategies often used is encryption. The idea of you need a key to unlock, to unscramble the data or the code in which the data is stored. So those are just some foundational cloud concepts we'll be talking about as we go through this presentation. Then we want to move to what are the business drivers that are causing you to consider moving to the cloud. In other words, I hope it's more than, hey, I saw this really cool demo. So we're going to go through and talk. Just generally, people should be looking what are the reasons they want to move to the cloud. You know, is it reduction in capital expenditure? We talked about the movement of CapEx to OpEx, personnel, operational costs, so forth. A lot of people think that you just immediately go to the cloud, you wash all these costs out of the business, which is probably not a completely accurate way to look at it. The other thing you want to think about is why are you moving to the cloud? What's your intended impact? Are you just trying to save money, trying to make things simple? Are you trying to become a more agile business because of scalability issues? Are you trying to get a handle on, are there some things that you just can't do from a security standpoint that you feel you can do better in the cloud? These are the business drivers you need to be thinking about. Compliance might, in some cases, may provide you some additional things like outsourcing your credit card processing, those types of things might help you from a compliance standpoint, might make it easier to do. But I think what we want to do is we really want to be realistic about costs, because consuming cloud services will be more expensive in the short term, right? You're introducing more pieces to manage, at least initially. There's going to be a skills gap that needs to be closed. You're going to have to do some planning if you're going to do this right. And you are going to, you may well uncover some technical debt. And what I mean by that is there may be some things that you've been able to kind of keep within in an on-prem environment. There's some stuff that maybe you haven't addressed from a security standpoint or from a data management standpoint that you felt comfortable enough that it was sitting behind the firewall inside of your organization, that now you are considering moving that into the cloud. What does that mean? You might have to address some of these issues. There may be some applications that need some additional work and cleaning up before you move those things to the cloud. So those are all costs that may be coming up. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these more specifically as we go through the presentation here. And then the last thing we want to talk about, I kind of alluded to it here, which is you may finally have to clean your garage. So these are, this is the kind of getting away from the sprawl. I see a lot of garages around town that they've got one car in them and they've got another side which is just full of stuff, old bikes, boats, canoes, who knows what. And a lot of people, from a data standpoint, they have a lot of stuff in their garage as well, and that can be, like I say, uncompleted applications or maybe customer data that's you're getting ready for or that you used in a marketing campaign some time ago, and that information you may not want in the hands of others, but it's in your garage. You can close the door. You feel fairly safe about doing that. And that is going to change when you start moving things into the cloud. So the idea here of this first 25, 30 minutes here was really just to kind of get us talking about some of the main concepts, that kind of thing that we're going to discuss from a strategy in terms of moving our computing operations into the cloud. So this is a good spot for me actually to hand it over to the folks at Fortinet who are our sponsors today. And I'm going to give them a shot at a quick, I think they got a few slides here they're going to show. And then we will pick it up when we're done with the Fortinet folks.
Yep. Hey, Mark, I'd forgotten you kind of have a dry sense of humor. So I like that last bullet point on cleaning out the garage, and let me give some context while Farsad's queuing up, and we'll have a different talk. But back when, boy howdy, mid-90s, and I was still, let's just say I was learning how to write, there was a guy up on Tiger Mountain, Stan Lisinski, who was kind of a guru with Microsoft Access, and he had a story, Mark, and it was in one of his books, and I kind of adopted his writing genre about grandma's closet. So when you was a kid and you go up to the attic at grandma's house and poke around, there's always fun and exciting things to find. And the analogy was in the context of access development. You get the point. But those those metaphors and analogies are very prescriptive, right? Because people go, oh, okay, I get it. And hopefully my writing style over the years has resembled that. But Mark, take a break. Catch your breath. Farzad, hello again, my friend. Another week, another city. Now, are you still down? But you're still in the same city, right? 1 week later.
I am. Yeah, absolutely. Thank God. There's a bit of a haze. I don't know. It's like there are some fires around us, and yeah. I mean, Napa's Napa's on fire actually, pretty much, and that's a sad thing. A lot of people are losing their houses, and there's nothing we can do. But
Farzad, let's jump right into it. I mean, last time we had fun and games and giggles, and we have some of the same audience. Let's get right into the content. Sir, I'm going to self-mute myself so you can speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Harry. I appreciate it. You're awesome.
Okay.
Well, hello, everybody, wherever you may be in our globe, Earth. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the folks at SMB Nation, Harry, Jenny, and Mark. Thank you. Also, I'm just going to talk very briefly. I'm not going to go into much details. Just give you a high-level view of Fortinet. Let me introduce myself first. I am Farzad Eliassi. I am a national account manager. Also, I support the efforts in Pacific Northwest for our channel accounts. Our partners, basically. Fortinet is a 100% channel company. We are the manufacturer. We don't sell anything directly. We do not have direct sales. Therefore, we utilize such great people such as you in order to help us secure the world. So, as you can see, the company was founded in the year 2000, an IPO in 2009, and in the past 15 years that we've been, in the market, we have become the fastest growing public cybersecurity company in the world. This number you see here, the 265,000 plus customers, that is a lot higher now. It's more than 300,000 globally. So even if we're not just considering United States, globally, we have the strongest international footprint of any of our competitors, and the most amount of units deployed, more than any other vendor, including Cisco. And, that is something that we are very, very proud of. Our HQ is in Sunnyvale, California, and if you look at the number of devices we have shipped globally, over 2 million devices, that is more than the next two competitors combined. All right, let's go to the next one. 1 second. All right. Now, as you can see, this is real proof of how fast we have grown and how far we have become in order to become one of the top cybersecurity companies in the world. Number of most important adaptation of Fortinet solutions by some of our largest enterprises and carriers in the world. You can see that in this slide right here. The ASIC technology, this gives us the fastest throughput in the industry. We have our own custom-made ASIC chip. Some of you technical folks, I'm not technical, I'm not going to get into it. You guys know the value of having a custom-made chip, and it takes a lot of load off of other things. And that's why we have the fastest throughput in the industry, and more than anybody else. And that is one of our best selling points, actually. Not only we're secure, we're also fast. We don't, you don't have to wait 40 minutes for your computer to log in just to be secure. And then there are different ways we look at security in general. I mean, the days of just the firewall are long gone. There are so many other I mean, the hackers are smarter. They're backed by countries. You know, these are like huge operations, and so there are different ways to approach it. So just having one firewall doesn't cut it anymore. There are many ways that you should be considering security. For the networking element, Fortinet has developed a parallel path processing architecture to give the best combination of performance and security. For example, the network processor, NP6, accelerates firewall, and so on and so forth. So we're not only we're a security company, but more than anything else, we are a engineering company. Both our founders are engineers, and we have over 3,000, about 4,000 employees. The majority of them are engineers. We have two major labs outside of the United States, one in Canada, over 200 researchers working daily. FortiGuard Labs. That's where it is. So the FortiGuard Labs, so as I mentioned before, we have the most amount of devices shipped out throughout the world. So all of these devices send reports to this lab. And if anything happens, something happens anywhere across the globe, that information is immediately sent out to FortiGuard Labs. Solutions are made, patches are made, and that information is immediately transferred to all devices, Fortinet devices across the globe. And that's another way of making sure that we're secure. Right. See. And it's always good to have a third party, telling you you're doing something right. And we do. For the past few years, according to Gartner, I don't have that one up here, but the partner Magic Quadrants, in terms of UTMs, we have been globally number one for a very, very long time. And just recently, in their latest Magic Quadrant for enterprise, we have become a leader. So we're one of the top three, actually surpassing. I don't know if I'm legally allowed to say it, but surpassing some of our biggest competitors. So that is always good to know. A lot of people, when they want to do research, that's the quadrant they look at, and everything else goes away. So we're there. And, we finally made our presence known there. All right. So that's pretty much a very high-level view of what Fortinet does. So in case anybody has any questions, I'm going to stick around till the end of this webinar, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you guys may have. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've taken myself off mute. We have a poll coming up, folks. While you're taking care of the poll, if you joined us late, once again, Harry Brailsford at SMB Nation. I'm coming to you live from Spice World, the annual SpiceWorks conference in Austin, Texas. Next year, I believe it's October 10th, 2018, for a couple days. Put it on your calendar. It's the Comic-Con of IT conferences. It's a lot of fun. Be sure to use the questions feature to ask your questions. And Mark, when we take it back to you, sir, correct me if I'm wrong, did you want to take, while you're bringing up your screen, did you want to take some questions now? I can open that up and see what the cat brought home.
Sure, we can see if there's some questions there.
Okay, hold on a second. I've got to go to my dashboard and get it so I can see it. Actually, we have one. From Rusty Brown out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Jenny's already answered it, but I'll ask it. Folks, be sure to ask your questions. Now is a good break point, and then Jenny will cover after Mark's finished speaking and read your questions a little bit later. Rusty Brown asked, great slides. Will you be sharing this PowerPoint deck? And Jenny goes on to reply that we have a recording of the webinar, and we'll be getting that to you within 48 hours. So, Mark, sir, with all due respect, I don't believe I see your screen, and if you want to take that over.
All right, I think Jenny may have to give that to me. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Jenny, I think.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, my friend.
All right.
There we go. All right, rock and roll.
All right. Well, I will. I think just to set expectations, I think this has been pitched as about a 90-minute webinar, so I've got about an hour to go, and I'll be sensitive to people's time. There's a couple things I could drop off the back if need be, but we'll see if we can't get through the material here. So let's pick it up again, and let's get rolling here. So, yeah, what are we trying to do here again? Again, kind of on our journey in terms of our secure journey, if you will, into the cloud. One of the things we really need to do is think about, what are our design requirements. This is not all that different than what you would do in an on-prem environment. It's just, some of the things you got to think about are different. But before we jump into that, I do want to talk a little bit about risk and risk appetite. Because this is an important, because cloud adoption initially was a little slow. I mean, I think we're still accelerating as far as cloud adoption goes. But certainly one of the early concerns about the cloud were security related, frankly, and it was risky to put stuff into the cloud, and because it was new, it was different. You couldn't put your hands on the computers anymore. But anyway, so let's just talk a little bit about risk appetite, which is really the amount or type of risk that an organization is okay with. It can vary wildly across organizations. Somebody selling lemonade on the side of the road versus somebody who's handling vast amounts of highly sensitive defense type of information would have two completely different risk profiles. And it's based on a lot of internal and external factors, whether you're publicly traded company, whether you're just a small business. There's a lot of things that go into defining what your risk profile, what your appetite is, and part of it is frankly just the aggressiveness of the business. I mean, I think we've seen, you saw some recent examples with Uber, for example, where their CEO's out. Some of his business practices, he took some risks in terms of the way that he moved that business forward, and they took a step back and they're reorienting. But those are all things that there's a lot of contributions to what makes up somebody's risk profile. But really, the fundamentals of risk are its likelihood that an impact will be realized. Generally speaking, people think about that as a bad thing. I actually have a financial background. The definition of risk in a financial background is really the variability. So it could be, you could make way more than you expected or way less than you expected. The risk would be seen from a pure risk standpoint as the same, even though you're happy to have the one outcome and not so much on the other. Risk can be reduced, but you can never fully eliminate it. And really, you have to balance the level of risk you're willing to take with, that's commensurate with the operations of the business to make sure that it survives and thrives. And it's legal, defensible to accept risk higher than the norm or greater than your competitors. Some people, it's full speed ahead, and come what may. They're gonna, maybe they don't back. Maybe they say, hey, backups take too long. Let's just rock and roll. We're going to assume that disk failures never happen, and off we go. And maybe they'll win. Maybe they'll get a hard disk failure and have issues with that. But that's a decision for them. But what's important to know is that, as far as in the context of what we're talking about here, is risk to health and human safety. These are risks that you must address to the industry you're working in. That could be OSHA, that could be, we've talked about PCI, those types of things. But it's kind of what's the regulation, and maybe it's just federal or state law. Maybe that's all what law you have to comply with. But there are things as far as health and human safety, which I say must italicize there because I'm sure there are plenty of examples where people aren't doing that. But for the reasonable people that are on this call, you would want to make sure that those risks are never, you're never putting those health and human safety at risk. Okay, so how do we address risk? Well, there's really four main ways. We can avoid it. You know, it's like, I think that's too risky, I'm not going to do it. So maybe that would be, maybe some people don't go base jumping because they just would prefer that they think that that's not so good. And some people have a problem jumping out of a plane even though they've got a parachute. But anyway, so you can avoid risk and just choose not to take on that activity. You can accept it. You can say, yeah, all right, well, I'm okay flying, jumping out of an airplane. I got a parachute. Let's do it. And then the other way you can manage risk is transference. So the scenario might be, hey, you know, chances are it's not going to happen, like our basement's going to flood and all our IT is going to go away. But if it did, it'd have a big impact. So what do we do? Well, in those cases, maybe we want to insure, so we can transfer some of that risk to an insurance company, for example, and that's a way to mitigate that risk, or transfer that risk rather. And then risk mitigation is, you know, let's do something to reduce the chances of it happening or minimize the impact if it does happen. So now we're talking about what are the controls and these types of things in an IT world, what are the controls and those types of things that I can put in place to mitigate the various risks that I'm confronted with in terms of running my business. And then what you're left over with is the residual risk, which is, you know, everything that you haven't avoided, accepted, transferred, or mitigated. And you can't make that go away. There's always something there. So with that being said, with an understanding of kind of what, you know, risk profiles and how we address risk, let's start with where we are today so we can make decisions in some form of reality. So as you're moving you're potentially moving aspects of your business to the cloud, you've got to understand that you really just need to understand the business. What are the business process? What are the assets? What's the business that we're in? What's required in order for us to do the business? And you're going to learn that through a series of interviews. You're going to interview managers, senior management. Maybe you're going to ask your customers. You're going to inventory assets. Fortinet, I think I went through their product sheet, and they've got a CASB, which you may or may not be aware of. It's pretty slick. A client access service broker is something you can put on your, basically on your exiting your premise out to the internet, and you can keep track of what people are going to site-wise. And a lot of people have used CASBs in the past because they've grown in functionality, but a lot of people have used that in the past to uncover what's referred to as shadow IT, or what's happening outside of my firewall. Because there's all these, you know, software as a service, these types of things popped up as being available. A lot of people, or some people, would choose to bypass IT and go get that themselves, and that's a risk to the organization. And CASBs can help identify some of those behaviors, and so you can kind of reel that in. You're going to collect, go through the process of record collection. So, you know, what's my bandwidth? What are my where are my financial records? Where are they stored? What kind of insurance have I got? Is there marketing data that I have? You know, you really need to inspect the business and understand where you are today, understanding the regulatory mandates listed there. So we've got, these are just a few, but you've got, you know, credit card information, you've got medical, you've got you know, maybe federal requirements, you've got the general data protection regulation, which we'll talk about a couple times through the presentation here. But ultimately, you know, you really need to analyze what your business needs, which makes sense, and then figure out what you're going to do to change or to fix that. So, you're going to start off with an inventory of your assets. You're going to include both tangible and intangible. And intangible assets, especially in the cloud world, a lot of people start talking about reputation, right? So bad things happen, you know, you have a breach, these types of things, and what's that do to your reputation? That's a big intangible and something that people need to pay attention to. And then what kind of personnel have you got? Have you got the right people to manage this a different environment? We talked about early on that one of the things that may cost you more in the short term is, you know, maybe you've got some training, you've got some skills gaps to close. But anyway, you need to go through and do an inventory of your assets. Then you want to go ahead, you want to place a value to those assets. You want to figure out what's the cost of losing a particular asset if something were to you breached, or if you lost your ability to do backups. What are all these assets that I have? What are their costs if they went away? The people that are on the line should be the guys that do those asset valuations, as they've got the best insight into it. And that's ultimately going to help you with, and maybe you've done this, larger organizations, this would be pretty typical. You get down to the mom and pops, they may be, they're thinking about these things in their heads. But you're really going to want to have a business impact analysis. That's going to be very helpful in this process. And that can be, the business impact analysis, as I said, in a large organization, this can be a very big process to put something like this together. Ideally, it's quantitative, or parts of it are quantitative versus qualitative. But sometimes in a small business, all you can say is, this would be really bad, this would be, I could live with it, and whatnot. You need to think about the materiality of these assets, whether they're crucial to the business. And it's really important from an insurance standpoint. If you think about when you think about things like data breaches, these types of things, and maybe you're in the medical business, it's important for insurance, because if you have, maybe you start considering cyber insurance and these types of things. But if you do that, you are also going to have to understand what the cost, you're going to have to say, I'm going to buy a policy for X dollars. Well, you need to understand what your asset value is in order for you to purchase the appropriate amount of insurance. So that's an important process here as well. The business impact analysis is going to do a lot for you. It's going to help you prioritize and value your assets processes. It's going to help you with further analysis of your business as far as what your disaster recovery and business continuity plan look like. Again, you're going to consider what's the impact of losing some of these assets that make up your infrastructure, frankly both physical and digital. And it's going to help identify, critical points in the business, where you've got single points of failure, where you don't have redundancy, and maybe some of the costs that you're incurring because of compliance. As you go through this process, then you're going to determine the critical nature of these assets. Is it, as I said, you can live without it, you can't live without it. It's the crown jewel of the business. The senior management, the business leaders need to be involved in that process, again, because IT and security support the business objectives, not the other way around. So you do need to get some input from senior management sometimes in terms of the importance of some of these things. And I know sometimes that can be a challenge. And again, that will help you crafting your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. All right, so going through that process, kind of where are we? Well, we established what our business requirements are. We've identified the key assets. We understand the environment we're working in. We've got a handle on the impact of losing any of these assets. We understand the risk appetite of the business and ways that we can address the risk. But there's one more thing, and that's your garage. Your garage. This is, if you look at a lot of security programs that are put in place, that you can't not do this. It's a pain. Some people are good about doing it. I think a lot of people are not so good about it. But before we get into why you need to go through and classify the data, or basically start cleaning out your garage, has to do with understanding the data lifecycle. Which starts out where you create and store the data. So where is that happening? Is that happening on a phone? Is it happening on a desktop? Where am I storing it? Am I storing that locally? Am I storing it in the cloud? As data moves through its life cycle, those are the types of things we need to think about. So we create data, we store it, then we turn around, we use it, and we share it. Well, who gets to use it, right? Who owns the data? Who's okay to share it with? You get into things like access control lists and these types of things in terms of the data. And then the next one is, well, at some point it probably gets archived, and then ultimately it gets destroyed. I mean, that is the data life cycle. As far as the archiving and destroying it goes, when does it get destroyed? How does it get destroyed? Where is it? Where do you store it? Your archives. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, a lot of organizations, we're pretty good about going through maybe the first 4 steps here. Maybe we're good about archiving, but a lot of times people just really have a hard time letting go of stuff. And so a lot of times that's a lot of what's in your garage. You know, it just kind of builds up over time. It's not a high, not a high priority. You know, it's, you know, you feel it's reasonably safe. It was in your organization. It's within the bounds of your, you know, you can lock the office door and you can kind of put that stuff in there. And this is changing a lot. You know, what is your data? This is changing a lot now that you're talking about putting your data in a public place. And I think I've thought about it, you know, kind of the metaphor here in terms of, you know, how comfortable would you be, you know, starting off unlocking your server door and letting everybody in the organization into the server room? And then how comfortable would you be putting your servers out in the lobby of your building maybe? And then how about putting your servers out in the, right? So I think the further that data gets away from you, probably the more uneasy you might be about, well, God, should I leave that out in the parking lot overnight? You know, what could happen to it? And those are the types of things you have to think about, or why it's important to think about those things when you're considering what you're moving to the cloud. So like I say, I think this is why I refer to this as your opportunity to clean the garage. There's kind of some fun pictures up here. Maybe that's what your accounting departments, you go into your accounting department, maybe there's, you know, boxes and boxes of old financial information that's been there. And then, you know, that's just something to be, this is something that the CPA office, those guys are pretty good. They do their taxes. You see the shredding truck show up and they shred that stuff. But organizations sometimes have a tendency to hang on to stuff, which at some point can potentially be a liability for you, not only from the standpoint of, you know, maybe there's something that somebody can come back on, or somebody makes a records request or whatever else, it becomes very difficult to maybe organize that data. So the next thing we need to do is we want to go through a data inventory and discovery process. So we want to figure out where our data is, who's responsible for it, who should have access to it, do we need to monitor its use? And in other words, is it important? Do I need to know about the fact that somebody just copied my customer database to their Dropbox account or something like that? Why is the data still here? Right? Is there a reason for us to archive it or for us to have it around? Is it something that we should archive and put somewhere safe that's maybe not, you know, safer or long-term storage? Maybe we send it up to you know, some archiving company or storage locker, or do we to shred the data in the cloud, which is referred to as crypto shredding? But through all this data inventory and discovery process, you need to keep that data lifecycle in mind. You know, so that is, you know, we're going to go ahead and, you know, create, use, you know, share, archive, destroy. That's just something you need to think about, to kind of have in your mindset as you go forward. So there's a lot of things you can do here as far as how you can categorize data. You might categorize it based on a regulatory framework. So, you know, financial information related to SOX might be tagged a particular way. Maybe you've got healthcare information, credit card information. Business functions, functional unit, department office. These are all different, just kind of examples of how people might categorize their data. So that, you know, that's fairly straightforward. And the other thing you need to do also now is classifying this data. What is the data you have? Is it sensitive data? Is it required for jurisdictional purposes? Is it critical? Is it high, low, normal? These are also different ways to classify data. And the jurisdictional one is interesting for the GDPR that's coming down the road, which is an EU regulation, but it's going to apply to some US companies because if you are maintaining data about, if you have more than a casual business relationship that involves EU citizen data, you're going to have to treat that data a different way. And so from that standpoint, maybe you need to understand in your with your customers where they live, what's the jurisdiction applied to that data. The other thing you're going to do is you're cleaning your garage. You're going to go through and do some data labeling, perhaps. A lot of this stuff happens automatically, right? Data creation. I mean, that's the files the date the file was saved and wherever the medium it was saved. You know, when do you destroy it? I know in SharePoint there are archive dates and these types of things you can put on data that lives in SharePoint. Again, confidentiality, handling directions. How do you get the information in and out of the organization? Who gets access to it? Jurisdiction, regulation. Again, these are just other things in which you may want to label your data. And the importance of this is really because if you don't understand what you have, it's going to be very difficult for you to make decisions about how you're going to try to protect it. So there's a lot of ways for discovering data through the labels, through the metadata, actually searches of the content. But one of the things that comes up from time to time for businesses, hopefully it doesn't happen that often, but maybe you are hit with a data discovery request from a legal standpoint, and you have to produce information. And it's no longer in your garage, right? You can't go thumbing through your boxes. You actually need to figure out some way to get that data probably in a fairly timely fashion for whatever entity is requesting it. So again, it's different trying to get that data out of the cloud than it was in your garage. I'm going to mention the GDPR again here. The GDPR has some functions in it, or some requirements in it, that says the EU citizen should have the ability to ask for the right to be forgotten. In other words, hey, what do you guys need my data for anymore? You don't need it anymore, get rid of it, right? So unless you have ways to categorize the information that you have on maybe some of your customers, that's going to be very difficult to comply with. As will people now in the EU, and this goes into effect in May of next year, have the ability to say, hey, give me a copy of everything you've got on me. And the company has 1 month to fulfill that request. So there's a number of reasons, you know, a lot of them are regulatory, but there's other reasons why you want to go through and categorize the data. And obviously, I think the most important one is to help you identify the key information that you need to protect and make some decisions about what you move into the cloud. So it's a starting point. Again, it's important to understand what it is and how you're going to secure it. It helps identify some protection priorities that should fall out of this. Helps you understand, you can set the minimum requirements as far as maybe all you do is the extent of your data classification might be, you know, this is okay for public consumption, this is internal, or this is confidential. But somehow where you begin to break apart that data, break down that data and tag it in such a way that you can apply some rules to protecting that data, you'll find that, you know, so you're going to go through, you're going to find and protect your data, you're going to protect your high value assets. Any of these things that are sold to help with, you know, watching the throughput of data through your organization are very dependent on your data being classified or tagged in such a way so that those automated processes can keep an eye on that data for you. So that's why it really is important to do. I understand that in a very small business, this might seem like overkill, but as you get into larger organizations, and certainly I think that there may be some, the winds may be changing towards organizations' treatment of people's data in the U.S. Certainly the Equifax thing has led a lot of people, I hope, to be scratching their head a little bit going, well, why do they have that information? What do they need that for? So anyway, so this is a way to get started, and something this was kind of like the first step here. So some strategies that we have to protect the data. We've got encryption, right? So using keys or algorithms to encrypt the data so that you have to have a key in order to read it. This is a big topic, but one of the things you consider as far as key management is, do I keep the key with the cloud provider so that if my cloud provider gets hacked, they get my data, it's encrypted, so, oh, I feel safe, except, oh, wait a minute, my key's up there too, and maybe they got that. So there are decisions about key management and encryption when you're considering moving things into the cloud. masking, obfuscation, atomization, and tokenization, right? What can you keep away from the eyes of people in your organization? You know, kind of a need-to-know basis. You know, clearly, I think that you wouldn't want everybody in your organization to see the full Social Security numbers of your customers. Maybe there are very few people that need, and your employees for that matter too. Probably few people that need that, maybe the HR department for payroll processing, that kind of thing. But again, for your own data and data that maybe you're maintaining on other people, there are a lot of strategies related to protecting that data and really making it harder to put all the pieces together to make it valuable for somebody who's trying to get at it. You've got security and event management. So this is collection and analysis of log data. I kind of alluded to this before when I talked about some of the tools and software products that are out there that, you know, can do some auditing of data that require the metadata. That there are a lot of systems out there that will allow you to collect and analyze that data. Setting up dashboards, automated responses. So when something happens, you're alerted, or maybe the software will shut down a port that somebody's trying to get at data. And the other thing to think about here is machine learning, which is a lot of this stuff was all about, and we did a pretty good job of this on-prem. We instrumented a lot of the operations. We kind of got it down to science. We put a lot of frameworks in there, like, you know, you've got IDLE and other types of frameworks, all of which need to change when they move into the cloud. But machine learning is important here in that just the benefits of cloud computing that people are taking advantage of, this huge scalability, computing power, and so forth. When you think about machine learning, you know, the bad guys have the same resources available to them now. And what we're finding is that, you know, the amount of log information and that kind of thing that gets generated by various applications is enormous. And in order to go through it, it's getting outside of the, you know, people are having a hard time getting their arms wrapped around it, especially in large organizations, just because you can't go through that much log information, and it's a lot of alerts to set and what have you. And this is really where machine learning is making a lot of inroads in terms of looking for patterns and doing kind of a better job than humans as far as identifying where security breaches are happening, which goes to the point of, you know, think about it as you're moving to the cloud. What is it? How are you going to know that you've been hacked? Right? If you're a little guy, that's a good question. If you're a bigger guy, you know, a bigger organization, you know, you may have a lot of big security and team in place that's doing a lot of monitoring and pen testing, that kind of thing. So again, these are all things to think about as you're moving into the cloud. The last one here we alluded to earlier, the kind of the egress monitoring or data loss prevention systems. So again, you want to, you know, you can focus a piece of software or hardware combination to watch the stream of data that's moving through your organization, what it is, how it's classified, where it's going, and raise alerts based on the in what's happening there. And this is becoming an interesting challenge for some, in that what's happening now is a lot of times these systems that did a lot of deep analysis into the traffic we're actually able to go in there and dive into the packet and do some analysis on the content itself. And the reality is that now quite a bit of traffic is going through is encrypted, which makes it much more difficult to do inspection in the packets. It also makes it slower, which people don't want. So there's a lot of challenges around trying to keep an eye on where your data is going. Just something to be, again, aware of when you're you know, kind of determining what your risk is and what you want to put where and for how long. So let's look real quickly here at just kind of cloud security generally and what to watch out for. And we're going to go back to this that we saw before, which is this matrix between the various security layers and whose responsibility and where there's some shared responsibility for the various service models. And I think the thing I want to point out here is that these two have never changed, right? So the governance, risk, you know, compliance, and data security has always been the enterprise's responsibility, and really will continue to be their responsibility. The difference is now is that it was probably a little bit easier to do it while it was all the stuff was in your garage or behind your firewall. And now when things are moving outside of that, that's where really the challenges are coming from. And that's why it's so important to go through that process of classifying, identifying your assets and your data. Because as you move things into the cloud, the environment is such that it is, the threat vector is quite a bit wider in the cloud. Not to say that there aren't strategies to address that, but just generally the instrumentation of the cloud is okay, but not what it is on-prem. And because of virtualization, you'd have issues with you don't have the visibility that you had to be able to actually see the disks where some of this stuff is stored. So to bring up, so we talked about the shared responsibility model, and then who has the ultimate liability for the adverse impacts resulting from data loss, misuse, breach, and cloud. And hopefully this isn't news to people, but it may be, which ultimately it is you, the data owner. At the end of the day, you are responsible, you are supposed to be the responsible steward for the data inside your organization, especially if you've got it, if you have information there about other people. And I think the Equifax thing really brought that one home, which is, what were they doing to protect that sensitive data? What were they doing as a steward of your personal information? And right now, the reality is that responsibility lies with you, right? I mean, so the person who owns that data. So the one for Equifax, squarely falls in their lap, being responsible for it. What the outcome of that is, we'll see. Maybe the landscape will change, and there will be some additional remuneration that can happen as a result of that, rather than just kind of the guys resigning and walking away. That's not the way it is in Europe, and I think we have a lot of room in the U.S. to grow in that standpoint. So with that, let's go on to talk about kind of the risks to cloud computing. You've probably heard of these: the vendor lock-in, proprietary APIs and services. When you're, as much as the ability for you to move virtual machines and whatnot between an Azure and a Google and a AWS environment, for example, a lot of tools that allow you to kind of image create a VM of a Windows machine and move from one platform to the next. When you start utilizing the platform services, you are starting to take advantage of the APIs that have been exposed by the platform, whether that be Azure, AWS, Google, or others. And to some degree, that's locking you into that platform, right? I mean, the more you go down that path, maybe the more difficult it is for you to interoperate or have an application that spans two clouds. So that's something to consider. It's good, not good, bad, or indifferent. It's just the way it is. And I think what we're heading into here in the next foreseeable future here is, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all these guys are putting out very rich APIs at a pretty quick pace. And you're going to consume them, you're going to make some decisions, and we're going to run into these API wars where a lot of the architecture that's going to be coming out is going to be here's a big long list of services that I have that you don't. But the reality is that all these platforms are pretty robust with respect to their platform and APIs. But you can get locked in potentially to one vendor or another by in terms of how deeply you utilize their APIs. Vendor lockout is one people don't always think about, which is what happens when your cloud provider goes bust. I think that's pretty unlikely with kind of the big three or big five. But there certainly are things to consider when you are using a software as a service application where maybe it's somebody who does oh, I don't know, maybe it's you know, an email program or something that you're using to do marketing emails, and for whatever reason that organization goes belly up, and you no longer have access to your data because it's locked down inside of the bankruptcy or whatever else you can't get to. So that's a risk that you have in you know, moving stuff to the cloud. And then there's just some inherent risks in cloud computing as far as, you know, conflict of interest, escalation of privilege, information legal activity. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we are in a you know, in a shared environment, and certainly you can pay more sometimes on the various cloud platforms to ensure that your information is on its own hardware that's identified and what have you. That's going to cost you more money. But for the, you know, the majority of us, and for purposes of this conversation, we're talking about, you know, kind of generally available, you know, kind of baseline cloud services. All these, this multi-tenancy provides the risk of, when we first talked about information bleed, it's like somebody popping out of their virtual environment, getting over into your virtual environment. Doesn't happen that often. It can. These are, you know, these are kind of low-level bugs and vulnerabilities that get uncovered that are patched pretty regularly by the big players. But that may not be the case for some of the smaller players, so that's just something to keep in mind. The next thing we're going to look at here is this is kind of a risk by the cloud model. And it's important to point out here that these are additive risks. In other words, the same risks that exist in an IIS environment, you know, when you start using the APIs, those risks get applied, and then software as a service, those things get applied. So I'm not going to go through all these in detail. I think we've talked about some of them as we've been going along here. I think one of the interesting ones with virtualization, though, I will point out is this data seizure one. So conceptually, cloud provider may have your information, you know, the disk storage is virtualized over many servers, and you know, it's redundant, and sometimes they even do what's referred to as bit splitting, where your data is actually broken up like in a RAID array across data centers across the world, you know, across the country or the world in some cases. That has a risk in two things. One is that there's maybe jurisdictional risk because the data is not supposed to leave a particular country, but the more interesting one is when you are sharing the physical disks with another you know, company, and there's something happens, and maybe a subpoena comes along, and somebody go ahead and seizes those disks, your data might be on it, and it might prevent you from getting the data. But more importantly, it may be that your data, which is now in the hands of somebody else. So again, those are kind of some interesting things to think about. It's not going to apply to everybody, but it is a consideration. So now we're going to go through a couple of strategies as far as you know, what you might do. There's some general guidelines as far as, you know, actual hardware. It's pretty typical. This is kind of what you'd typically be doing in an on-prem environment. You know, removal of guest accounts, closing down unused ports, making sure that you've cleaned up passwords, strong passwords, adding that you've got admin accounts set up specifically for administrative functions, turning off services. You know, this is all about trying to reduce the threat vectors and the amount of attack vectors that you've got. Maintaining your servers on a regular basis. And this really, the same thing applies if you simply are moving your existing infrastructure or virtualized infrastructure into the cloud. These are still important, right? You've added another layer because now you've got to secure the pathway to get from your on-prem clients to your virtualized infrastructure in the cloud. So while these might have come up and started out in the, you know, in the on-prem world, they're still applicable to servers that you might have deployed in the cloud. So then hardening your endpoints, right? People can really can get to your data from, you know, these are just your users can get to your data from all over the place. Their cell phones, their home machines, and what have you. So want to make sure all that stuff has some kind of you know, antivirus, anti-malware software on it. An interesting point here is, especially with these mobile devices, is the ability to remotely wipe out a phone, for example, if it's lost. This is a really curious one, and I think a lot of people, this is a challenge for them, because anymore the lines between a corporate phone and a personal phone are different. Not very many. It would depend on the organization, certainly, but there's a lot of companies where people put their work email on their phone. So what happens when that phone gets lost? Well, you've just lost some of the company's data. Should the company be able to wipe down that phone? Those are things that need to be developed through an authorized use policy inside your organization. That's a big risk for a lot of people. I think they just don't address it, right? Out of sight, out of mind. That phone's in his pocket. I don't really have to worry about it, until it's lost, and the financial numbers were on a spreadsheet that was emailed to somebody, and somebody gets into that phone. So you want to use some form of local encryption, things like BitLocker, those types of things in the Windows world. Strong access controls, multi-factor authentication is important. VPN solutions, again, you're trying to encrypt your traffic between, in transit, and maybe a DLP system that you're going to put in place to help harden those endpoints to understand it if people are pulling information down that they shouldn't be. Encryption is a key part of utilizing cloud services. There's different levels of encryption at different price points on the various cloud platforms. So you can think about storage and archiving. How encrypted is that data going to be? The other thing sometimes people don't think about is if you're operating in an IIS platform and you are backing up VMs, where are you backing those VMs up to? Because if they're not encrypted, somebody could basically nab that machine if they had access to it, and basically have access to that machine. They can just swipe it virtually and then bring it up in another instance. You also think from an encryption standpoint, we talked a little bit about masking and other things as far as the data, as far as the users inside of a database, like not visibility to social security numbers and so forth. But you can use encryption to basically encrypt fields so they're not readable in the database, even by the database admins. It's going to be through your access control list. You're going to provide that information only to the kind of a need-to-know basis. So encryption can help you out there. And again, we talked about encrypting data in transit, right in and out of your endpoints into your cloud infrastructure. And this is really all, again, about ensuring the integrity and confidentiality of the data in transit. The CIA that continues to we want to think about that as we go through this process. Layer defense in depth, you've probably heard this before. It's a general concept of having to get through multiple checkpoints, if you will, to get at the data that they're after. So this is why it's important that you really pay attention to the type of data, who can get to it, what the access controls are in place, and making sure you're not losing the keys, i.e., people being able to get in through through fake credentials or what have you. You want to maximize the number of security blocks that are in there as far as people getting to your data. So probably the easiest one to best defense is simply one of education. I mean, the weakest link are the people involved. Remove the dumb mistakes. Try and educate your users about social engineering, phishing attacks, these types of things. I just read an article this morning. It's one of the big four accounting firms, and they had somebody sitting on their Exchange server for a number of months because they got in with admin credentials, leaked credentials. So a lot of that stuff, I mean, a lot of the stupid mistakes, if you will, or the dumb mistakes are easy to fix through education, and it's got to be an ongoing process. So threats change all the time, and you need to address those and make sure that people are aware of them. Security awareness is a big thing. It's not anything, and reminders are, regular reminders are an important part of this. So now we're going to kind of move into an interesting area, which is just we're going to talk about cloud application security. And this really goes to utilizing the cloud providers' platforms as you're building applications. And this would be true of, if you're going to kind of roll your own and build it using those tools, or whether you are in the process of building a software as a service solution. These are all applicable to you and development generally. So what are the common cloud migration pitfalls with respect to application security? Well, on-prem apps don't always transfer well. A lot of times they assume that the data was close from a speed perspective, and maybe moving that stuff into the cloud is going to slow it down to the point where that application is not going to work very well in the cloud, and that thing needs to get refactored. Poor documentation. I'm sure everybody in your organization has spotless documentation, and you can put your finger on, issues or questions about code anytime. I think that's a nice pipe dream. But I think it's more like Ferris Bueller. It's like, hey Bueller, anyone who's got good documentation. So that's just kind of a natural. Again, it's nobody really likes doing it. I've talked to a lot of developers, and they assure me that things are documented well, and it's maybe documented for them, but somebody coming in to read the code, that's difficult. That can provide some challenges in terms of looking at your applications from a security standpoint and potentially moving them into the cloud. Not all apps are cloud ready. Encryption maybe wasn't necessary. It was an application you guys were using behind your firewall. It was an internal application. Now you've moved it to the cloud, and now the application is not encrypting the data. That's not a good thing. You're probably gonna have to go back and refactor that application. And then the tenancy separation. In other words, if you've got your application, your application that was previously run on-prem, and now you're running a portion of it in the cloud. The fact that it's moving between these, the cloud and your tenant may provide some challenges. But most importantly, I think the big challenge here is making sure that you're using secure and validated APIs. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a bit later on, but just be aware of that. So what does the life cycle look like? Typical, this looks like a lot like the software development life cycle. It's very similar, right? We're defining, designing, developing, testing, and then we're putting things securely into operations. The thing that might be a little bit different here is maybe some people haven't always thought about the disposal of the application. It may be that maybe you retired an application, but you still wanted access to the data. So that was on a virtual machine. You did an image of the machine. You stuck it in a drawer somewhere, and if you had to go back to get to the data, you can do that. Well, think about how you'd handle that in the cloud. You may not want that huge old database that maybe still has relevant information in it. You may not want that just laying around in the cloud. Maybe that's something that once you're done with it, you do archive it maybe on site. I mean, these are all kinds of things for you to be thinking about. Identity and access management. We want to be thinking about this is a crucial part of your usage of the cloud. Identity management, right? Who you are, and then let's authenticate who you are through some kind of authentication. And then authorize your access against a set of controls that you put in place, and that we're going to map that against the management's policy in terms of who should be able to get to what. You've got federation issues to concern yourself with when you're building applications, which is, are you going to rely on a third party to say that this guy is who he says it is, or are you going to do that inside of your own identity repository? So because of the fact that, because so many people are, the humans are the tough part of the equation here. That's where a lot of the vast majorities of the breaches take place, is they're taking advantage of human flaws, whether that be phishing attacks or whether that's through just poor configuration. making sure that the right person is in there and you've assigned the appropriate access controls to your data is critical for part of your application development process. Some of the threats that are available to, the threats that are present from an application standpoint, you refer to, Microsoft uses something that's called the Triad model, which stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. You can see kind of some shorthand explanations of these in kind of a physical world, although these are really concepts that apply from a development standpoint. So spoofing, you don't like, you're not who you say you are. Tampering, hey, somebody messed with the data. Repudiation, hey, I ordered this thing on your website, but I don't want to pay for it. And how do you make sure that you can make sure that there's not a repudiation? In other words, how do you get around the fact that the person says, hey, it wasn't me? There's strategies to do that. Again, things to think about as you're developing, utilizing the cloud APIs. Information disclosure, how does the information get out there? Denial of service, we've heard about denial of service attacks, both on-prem and bots taking, can hit you in the cloud as well. Elevation of privilege, again, this is somebody getting in and then getting a hold of those administrator credentials in terms of, and then the kind of the havoc they can reach, caused by doing that. And then the next thing we're going to look at here is, is something you should be aware of, which are, if you haven't heard of this is a resource available kind of some of your developers, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. These are the top 10 web-related flaws that people are taking advantage of. And SQL injection, broken authentication session management, you can look at the comparison here. You'll see that they don't change, it hasn't changed a lot in the last 4 years. The 2017 hasn't been finalized yet. But basically what it is, we have solutions to all these things, but the developers need to make sure that they are checking for this kind of thing as they're writing their code and keeping this thing in mind. Okay, we're going to move on to, so hopefully that's given you, some tools and some ideas to think about as far as utilizing the APIs. We're going to move on to operating in the cloud. So in the conference I was at a couple weeks ago, the Microsoft security guy came out and he said, Azure is putting out, the environment's changing about every 4.61 hours. So they're adding functionality, they're adding APIs, they're doing all this kind of stuff at a very, very rapid pace. And the result of that, you really need to think differently about how you approach security because the environment's always changing. Microsoft's going to do a good job, and the big guys are going to do a good job vetting their applications to ensure that, it's backwardly compatible, that they're not suddenly going to turn something on mistakenly that's going to put you in jeopardy. But if you think about maybe some of the other people you interact with, maybe Facebook and some of these other guys, when they change security policies and these types of things, and suddenly you find information being shared that you hadn't planned on sharing. So those, again, it's a very dynamic environment, and that's much different than what we were all about in terms of really trying to corral that within a firewall. So it's a different world. You got to pay attention. Most importantly, this is really near and dear to my heart, is we're really now talking about an information supply chain. You got to know your vendors and their APIs. You need to understand if they have what's their posture with respect to security. Have they vetted these APIs that they're publishing and making available to you? Contracts, be clear about what's happening at the edges, the blue boxes where we've got some shared responsibility and we're not sure exactly where the cloud provider hands off and we pick up. What are they doing in your contracts? What are you doing to ensure the security triad? What are you doing from a change management standpoint? What are the notifications that are in the contracts, right? So if you're using a software as a service application and those guys get breached, or you're utilizing an API and there's a security flaw discovered, what's the process by which they notify you about those changes, those breaches? Those are all things that we now need to start paying attention to in the cloud world, because these contracts and these service level agreements are really the only thing we have to control what's happening in this virtualized world that we can't actually touch. So it's really important you pay attention to that. And going through your the kind of knowing your provider, I'm going to give you a couple quick examples here with respect to HIPAA, and this came up in our conference a couple weeks ago. So there may well be small dentist office, doctor's office, or whatever else that are utilizing QuickBooks. QuickBooks, that's a regular, that's a very widely used application, but the reality is it's not HIPAA compliant. So they're suggesting here that you're not putting any personal information inside of QuickBooks. Well, the fact that they're seeing a doctor, and they know who the doctor is, and they know who the patient is, and maybe you billed for procedure, right? That's now, that's running against the HIPAA regulations. So I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but I just stuck with this HIPAA example. Same thing is true. I looked at Salesforce, and basically what they're saying is that Salesforce with a couple of other tweaks can be made to be HIPAA compliant, but it's not out of the box. So there's a lot of things that I think in your own mind you need to question as far as what I'm going to refer to that was popular a number of years ago, which is marketecture, which is what are these guys saying they're providing to you, and what's the reality of what they're providing to you. Microsoft's really, they're no different. They're in the same boat. They're saying that, CRM and Office 365, they can be compliant with HIPAA with some other things. So you do need to pay attention to, again, always what your data is, how you're going to protect it, what's the regulatory environment you're working with. So as far as knowing your provider, I know I've worked recently with an email product, an email API, and I thought it was going to work out. It didn't. But when I started digging into the details, what I found out was that it was actually running on top of Amazon Web Services, which is fine. There's no problem with that. But what I learned is that they really didn't have a whole heck of a lot of documentation or information that they could talk to me about security in terms of the way they implemented and accessed those APIs on Amazon. So it's really important that you understand your information supply chain and your vendors. So just some interesting snippets from the CSA conference. Culture eats strategy for lunch. In other words, if you are not building a security culture, you can have the best security strategy in the world, but if you are not building a culture that understands security and the risk, it's going to fail. The other one, that infrastructure is code, right? And this whole idea of now software-defined networking and virtualized services, and using scripting languages and Python and all these types of things, you are maintaining more and more code. And that code is, you're putting together solutions that include, more and more vendors, more and more code, and every one of those things has potential security vulnerabilities that you need to be thinking about as you're developing this code. I really think we're in this position where if we don't get our brain into thinking about security from the get-go as far as designing our applications and so forth, we're going to end up in a we're not going to make the problem any better. We're not going to have learned our lesson in terms of securing our assets. Choose doable security measures to implement and iterate. So the first thing to do is, I guess, make sure your users are, understand the social engineering threats that are out there, and certainly go through and you can harden your devices and that kind of thing. But go through things that are doable. You can't. I mean, there's a lot. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. There's a lot to do here. You got to pick the valuable assets first, how you're going to protect them, and work your way through as you're developing these strategies to secure this. Get rid of vendors that don't protect you, right? There's no reason in your supply chain that you should have somebody that's not paying attention to security and aren't watching. I mean, they're supposed to be your partner. They're supposed to be helping you out. They're not supposed to be exposing you to additional threats. So there's a lot of, we're in an era where there's a lot of people coming up. At some point the field will thin, but I think you really do need to do some very, very serious vetting of your vendors. Develop a security mindset. Coach, don't roll your eyes. When somebody clicks on an email they shouldn't have, don't roll your eyes and say, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. Coach them. It's a coaching opportunity. Figure out how it happened and how you can teach or coach a lesson there. I think security folks, in a lot of ways, and IT folks too, have a reputation of sometimes talking down to their end user community, and so we got to work on that if you're going to get them to buy into paying attention to security. And you got to include in your business strategy. Again, that's getting the right people to the table, and that's critical to really having an effective and safe move into the cloud. I'm going to go through these. I've got like 4 slides left. I'm going to go very quickly. We're going to move on to legal considerations. Again, you just think about the laws that you might be exposed to, both U.S. and internationally. Think about e-discovery, chain of custody, forensics. Chain of custody is interesting and very difficult to do in a cloud environment because everything's virtualized. The idea of chain of custody is that you can attest to the fact that this piece of data moved from here to here, and here it's sitting on the disk that I have that's been impounded. It's very difficult to do in criminal investigations and that kind of thing when these things are all virtualized and spread potentially across the world. And that makes forensics becomes more difficult in the cloud as well. But that's a topic for another day. Some of the concepts you need to be thinking about are criminal law, civil law, administrative law being EPA, IRS, that type of thing. It is important to point out here, criminal law in parts of in the EU and in a lot of countries, privacy violations are considered a criminal offense, as is knowingly violating HIPAA regulations. So the U.S. is way behind the rest of the world as far as I'm concerned, as far as our attention to people's privacy and personal information. I'm not sure how we're going to reel it back, but I think that something does need to be done. And that's just kind of me on my soapbox. But anyway, from there, let's go ahead. I think I'm on the last slide here. So again, what we're talking about here are, we've gone through a lot of material today. I apologize if it was too much or if you felt overwhelmed. What I've done here is kind of pulled together a summary out of a lot of courses that we offer regularly to some companies, as far as security awareness training, secure coding. We do threat modeling. We have GDPR courses. We've got a couple of things with a certified cloud security professional bootcamp coming up, as well as cloud platform that I know maybe a lot of partners on the call are still trying to get Azure certifications. We do that as well, and as well as project opportunities. So that's kind of my last slide here, wrapping it up. I think we might have kept you here a couple minutes late. I apologize for that. But certainly open to questions at this point, and I appreciate you guys giving me some time this afternoon, and hopefully you learned something and found the time valuable.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the great presentation. Hopefully everybody walked away with lots of new information and can go from there. Just a reminder that we are recording today's webinar, and I look for an email from me. It should go out in the next 48 hours, and that will have the replay in it as well as some other great information. Again, thank you so much to Fortinet for sponsoring this webinar. We couldn't have done it without them. And then last but not least, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the questions feature within the webinar system, and we'll be sure to ask those to Mark as they roll in. We've only got one comment so far, and that's good stuff. So thank you so much, Mark. If anybody has any questions, I'll stay on the line for just a minute longer. Nice presentation. So it looks like we don't have any questions, Mark. It looks like you covered everything during the presentation. So thank you so much, and we will wrap this up. And again, look for an email with me, which will have the recording as well as additional information regarding this webinar.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cheers.